All right. Endocrine system. 269. All right. Anatomy of, we'll talk about the anatomy, hormones. And then tomorrow, I had hoped that we were going to do lecture tomorrow, but instead of that, I'm going to let you, I have a chart for everybody to fill out over 8.2. Instead of doing lecture, I'll just let everybody read it and fill in the chart.
So we're just going over
that chart you can actually use on the test next week.
So we're just doing 8.1 today?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not very long, so.
So we can use our thing over the 8.2? So I'll probably do it tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll give you that. It's on the print. All right, so anatomy. Endocrine glands. Well, we know endocrine, you know what that means? Endo means?
Inside.
Inside. Crine means to secrete, so endocrine literally means to secrete within. Okay, so when we talk about the endocrine system, sounds like something, it's hard to, I feel like it's one that most people are not familiar with because it's not like your basic organs. It's not necessarily your heart and lungs. It's got like a lot of smaller organs that aren't in one location, right? They're all over. So endocrine glands, one thing to note is that they don't have ducts. Remember when we talked about the integumentary system and we had exocrine glands, like sweat glands and oil glands? Those all have ducts. Now, your endocrine system does not. Most of them secrete, most of the organs at least secrete just out from themselves directly into the bloodstream. So hormones is something that we'll talk about. Hormones are chemical messengers. And then they go, like I said, directly into the bloodstream. And then exocrine glands, again, we talked about those with the integumentary system. Those are the other ones that we've already talked about. Sweat, salivary glands, mammary glands, lacrimal glands, those kind of ones. Pancreas actually is an exocrine and an endocrine organ, so we'll talk about that later on, but something interesting to note.
Exo and endo?
Pancreas is. Because, here's why. It's an endocrine gland because it secretes like insulin, is one of the things that comes from the pancreas. But it's an exocrine gland because it secretes into the digestive system. And your digestive system, even though it's on the inside of our body, it's really kind of on the outside of our body because it's like a canal all the way down. So, anyway, yeah, your pancreas really is part of two systems. It's a major part of the endocrine system. It controls blood sugar, but it also, and you'll write about this tomorrow too, but it's also a major part of the gastrointestinal system as it secretes digestive enzymes. So it's got two, and there's two parts within the pancreas that do those things. All right, so some processes that are affected by the endocrine system. Here are some processes that are affected. Your carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. So metabolism is an endocrine process. Water and electrolyte balance is another process that's affected by the endocrine system. Reproductive activity. Growth and development. What did I put? Can't read my writing. Energy, balance, I think is all right. And then responses to stress.
What do you mean, like stress responses?
Well, just like it's talking about your norepinephrine and epinephrine. Like we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. How your fight or flight kicks in, adrenaline kicks in. Adrenaline is a hormone.
Oh, so okay.
So that's what it's talking about. All right, so we have a few different types of hormones we'll talk about. So steroid hormones, these are lipid-based, which means what? Fat. And we talked about steroids very beginning of the year being fat. So these steroid hormones are produced by what's called the adrenal cortex. Let me show you what I'm talking about when I say that. Flip over to page 277 real quick.
Okay.
All right, see where it has?
Oh, there's that.
Yeah, that's the adrenal gland. Okay. Is the yellow one. I don't know if I have this picture in there. There it is. Okay. So this is picture on 277.
Mm-hmm.
So the adrenal cortex, okay, is the outer kind of rim of the adrenal gland,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the adrenal medulla is the inside area. So anytime you see that word cortex, think it's the outer, like the cerebral cortex. Remember, it's the outer part of the cerebrum.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about same thing. The kidney has a cortex and a medulla too. So just so you know, when we're saying the adrenal cortex, it's specifically talking about hormones that come from that outer layer of that organ. And here we go. Okay. Steroid hormones can also be produced by the adrenal cortex and the reproductive glands. All right, amino acid hormones, these are protein-based, which makes sense, right? Because amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And most hormones are protein-based. These are most hormones.
Okay. And
then hormone receptors. I'll read one little section in here. Actually, we'll just read this on 270. Look where it says hormone receptors. See? Mm-hmm. Those hormones are transported throughout the body by the blood, which comes into contact with all the body's tissues and organs. However, hormones affect only the tissues and organs that have receptors specific to those particular hormones. So it's not just like your body releases a hormone, growth hormone, and it just floats around in your bloodstream and every single cell picks it up. It has specific places that it goes to. That makes sense? That receive that hormone and can take in the message. Growth hormone might not have been a good one to use for that. You were talking about prolactin or something. That's like a hormone that causes production of breast milk. Okay, it's only going to go to mammary glands. It's not going to go to your big toe.
Yeah.
It's time for you to produce milk. All right. It says, as you learned in chapter 1, a receptor is a transmitter cell that senses and responds to certain stimuli. When the hormone binds with this receptor, the hormone is able to influence the activity of the cell. The hormone does so by changing the cell's membrane permeability. When we talked about the plasma membrane and how it lets certain things in and out. So hormones affect those cells by changing how that membrane works. Increasing or decreasing enzyme activity, increasing protein synthesis, or stimulating, I never know how to say this word, but secretory activity. So those are the ways that it can work. So it either changes the cell's membrane, it changes what it lets in and out. It can change enzymes activity, like make them work really fast, or it can make them not work at all. Mm-hmm. Or it can work by increasing protein synthesis. Do you remember talking about protein synthesis when we got those little, we had all those manipulatives, and you opened up the ladder, like the DNA ladder, and the RNA hooked up to it.
Yes.
And then it went over and you added in your amino acids and it made a big long chain. Okay, that's what it's talking about with protein synthesis. So it can make it produce certain proteins or whatever. And then stimulating its secretion, so what it puts out. It says the receptors for steroid hormones are found inside the cell nucleus. So that's where those hormones would have to get all the way into the cell nucleus, which makes sense. Because what is the plasma membrane made of? Remember? Mm-mm. It's called a lipid
Yeah.
bilayer. And the same thing is true for the nuclear membrane, the one around the nucleus. It's made out of, I think it's just one layer, but it is made out of phospholipids. So steroid hormones are made out of fats. Okay, so those are lipids. So they're going to diffuse easily into the cell and then diffuse into the nucleus. Makes sense. By contrast, says the receptors for amino acid hormones are found on the membrane or the surface of the cell. So those receptors are found on the cell itself. When these hormones bind with the cell surface, it stimulates a second messenger inside the cell that will cause its response. And so it's a little bit more rounded version. But when a steroid hormone, the next paragraph, when a steroid hormone binds to the receptor inside a cell nucleus, the interaction between the hormone and the receptor alters the cell's DNA and activates messenger RNA, which is that's going to change the protein synthesis. RNA has to do with protein synthesis. Some hormones, such as epinephrine, have receptors at many different sites, making their effects widespread. So epinephrine that's your fight or flight. So it would have receptors at the heart. It would have receptors in the brain. It would have receptors in the lungs because it's going to have an effect on all those things. Others have fewer target sites, like I was talking about with prolactin, for example. It's going to be mammary glands. Okay? So let's look at upregulating and downregulating hormone receptors. As the activity of hormone receptors can be upregulated or increased or downregulated, which makes them more or less sensitive. So those receptors that are on the cell, they can either be like have an increased sensitivity or a decreased sensitivity to it. As exercise, for example, upregulates insulin receptors, making them more sensitive to insulin. So because exercise upregulates receptors, less insulin is needed to promote glucose uptake. So people who work out a lot don't have to make as much insulin because their body's already using extra energy anyway. And it does this, as it makes them more sensitive to insulin, so they don't need as much for it to do its job. However, obesity downregulates insulin receptors. So more insulin is needed to make your cells take in that glucose, which tells you that's why a lot of obesity are diabetic, right? Because they don't have enough insulin or it's just not working anymore. It says these two glucose uptake scenarios have important implications, right, for diabetics, just like we said. So that's kind of...
so once it's completely stopped and you are classified as a diabetic, does working out, can you reverse it and get them to work again?
I think that you can reverse it and make it where you don't necessarily have to take insulin anymore. But you always have diabetes at this point. I know that they're working on a cure for that. Anyway.
A cure for diabetes.
I'm working on it. That would be awesome.
They're also working on it for Alzheimer's. It'll be ready by 2025.
Really?
Like a vaccine. I'm excited.
All right, hormone secretion control. So basically how hormones are secreted or how they get the message to be secreted. One word I want you to write down is the word tropic, T-R-O-P-I-C. Tropic hormones. So tropic hormones are hormones that target other organs to secrete hormones. So
target other
hormones to release hormones. So, you know, their target organ is going to be another endocrine organ. So, for example, adrenocorticotropic hormone comes from the pituitary gland in your brain, and it affects the adrenal cortex. Well, then it causes the adrenal cortex to produce or to secrete some other hormone, cortisol, aldosterone, something else. So they have tropic hormones just make another endocrine organ secrete more.
Okay.
Because you'll hear that word a few times. So, okay, neural control. What would you think? Where would that be stem from?
The brain.
The brain, right. So this is epinephrine, can also include norepinephrine. It's not in here, but it's released during sympathetic nervous system.
Okay, so epinephrine, do they use that when people go into cardiac arrest?
Yes, they do. To make
Why?
the heart start. I think they do like a direct injection. It can make the heart start back up. And it's like, it's adrenaline. That's what it is.
So epinephrine is adrenaline?
Well, yes.
And how does that relate to the endocrine system?
It's secreted from should be adrenal cortex. No. Adrenal medulla, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Secreted from the medulla.
I only know that because of Grey's Anatomy. Round of epi.
Well, epi is also what you give like somebody's having an allergic reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So those particularly are when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, which is what?
When what?
Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. When does it kick in?
When you are,
What's the other name for that one? Fight.
Oh, fight or flight.
That's your sympathetic nervous
adrenaline?
system. So that's when epinephrine, your brain, tells your adrenal medulla to say, hey, we're under stress.
Mm-hmm.
We need some epinephrine and norepinephrine. So it sends a message, hormone to your adrenal medulla, it sends a neural, and then send a hormone. It sends a message, like a nervous message, to the adrenal medulla, and then it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which makes your heart rate go up, makes your breathing rate go up, all of that stuff that we talked about.
Okay.
All right, the next one is hormonal control. We can look at this too. It's on page 271, this picture is. So hormonal control is released by instruction of other hormones. So these are your tropic hormones. Well, tropic hormones cause them to be released, I guess I should say. Reword that.
Okay.
So it's released by the instruction of other hormones. So if you look, here's some examples on here. Okay, so you got your anterior pituitary gland. Anterior means what?
OA. Or anterior.
Front.
Oh, yeah, front. Possibly.
So that's the front part of the pituitary. So it sends this adrenocorticotropic hormone, that's what this stands for, to the adrenal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And then the adrenal cortex can release whatever it's been told to release down here, aldosterone or cortisone, whatever.
Okay.
So these are your hormonal controlled hormones because they're coming from a message from another hormone.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with these, all these. This is a neurally controlled hormone because, look, it comes directly from the brain.
Okay.
And then humoral control. Okay, on here, humoral. You think of humor, think liquid or blood, if you want to think of that. Like we talked about the humors in the eye, vitreous humor.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a fluid, basically. So humoral control means that it's measuring levels in the blood, and that's how it determines if it needs to be released.
Okay.
So those are going to be like your insulin and your glucagon. So they're figuring out how much blood sugar you have. If it's too low, we're going to inhibit insulin and tell you to promote glucagon the other direction. So that's all those. So humoral control means it's constantly measuring in the bloodstream and seeing, do we need more, do we need less, etc. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hormones and homeostasis. Oops. We talked about negative feedback before. Very, very, very beginning of the year. So it says this is a mechanism that reverses a condition that has exceeded the normal homeostatic range to control homeostasis. All right. So basically it's saying that's how all these humoral ones work. So you get too much sugar in your blood, it's going to stop that sugar and try to bring it back down. And then it stops the hormone by reading that you've got the right amount of sugar.
It's so amazing that our body does all that.
I know. Isn't that crazy? I agree. So look at here. Let's look at this loop. So all right. So first we've got this pituitary that stimulates the target glands by its normal hormones. Let's say we're talking about pancreas or whatever. Well, it doesn't come from there. Pancreas does its own thing. But let's say we're talking about we'll talk about prolactin or whatever. So sends a message to the target gland, says, okay, produce whatever you're supposed to produce or do whatever you're supposed to do. Then it goes down here, so it produces the hormone. Well, hormone gets released into the bloodstream. So once a few things, once there's enough, your body says, okay, there's enough of this hormone in my bloodstream, then that goes back to the anterior pituitary and back to the hypothalamus. And then it comes back and says, okay, we've got enough in the bloodstream, so let's shut this down. Comes back. It inhibits the anterior pituitary, which is what's making it go. And the same thing down here. So it's going to inhibit it from producing more. It's just a constant make this hormone, figure out that it has enough. Brain says, okay, we've had enough, shut it down. And then it's just constantly doing that. Okay. And it keeps a very narrow range, of what the normal would be. It's pretty crazy. Crazy. Okay, let's look at this body temperature. This is something we've talked about before anyway. It says in chapter 1, you learn that the thermostat in home functions much like the negative feedback loop in our bodies. We talked about, remember, the hypothalamus works like a thermostat. Mm-hmm. So we get too hot, we sweat, we get too cold, our blood vessels constrict and try to retain heat, different things like that. It says when the temperature falls below the set point, the furnace turns on, and when the home reaches the desired temperature, it turns off. So it works the same way as your hypothalamus. It says if your body temperature drops below 98.6, the hypothalamus sets in motion a series of responses. So look up here, look at this chart right here. Okay, so normal body temperature is 98.6. Mm-hmm. So if it goes above that, okay, the sympathetic nervous system has been stimulated, mm-hmm. and blood vessels in the skin dilate, and sweat glands are activated, right? Because that reduces heat. Because those blood vessels, when they get closer to your skin, they lose heat through your skin. Body heat is lost. Body temperature drops down back to normal. Now, if the body temperature drops below normal, then the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated again, but this time the blood vessels contract, right? So they get smaller, so they'll retain heat. Thyroxine is secreted, and then shivering occurs, right? Because what does shivering do? What's it do?
I don't know.
Shivering. What happens to your muscles?
They contract.
They contract, which produces heat. Anytime your muscles contract, they produce heat. That's one of the things that they put on. So shivering occurs, body heat is conserved. You start building up your body heat. Body temperature heads back to normal, goes back up. Now, as long as you stay within a normal range, you're not going to do this all the time. Mm-hmm. But so sometimes, it depends on how hot you are, how cold you are, how long it takes to get back to normal. Let's read this case study. It might be interesting. On 273 at the bottom right-hand side. It says, when Jordan Romero decided he wanted to become the youngest person to climb Mount Everest at 13 years of age, he and his dad embarked on a training program to get his body into shape. The 8,848 meter climb, it's crazy. How high is that? 29,000 feet. It's like almost 6 miles, isn't it? Yeah. Well, 5.5, something like that. 5. Would challenge Romero's body, particularly because lower oxygen concentration in the air at high altitudes diminishes blood oxygen levels. You probably noticed that before. If you go up in the mountains, you breathe faster. While at sea level, Romero spent many hours in an altitude tent where he was exposed to a hypoxic environment. Hypo means, what's hypo mean? Hypo rhymes with low. So hypo's low.
So, yeah.
And oxo's oxygen. So hypoxic means low oxygen. The hypoxic environment of the altitude tent stimulated the environment near the peak of Mount Everest. The low oxygen content of the air that he was breathing stimulated his kidneys to secrete erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production.
Carry oxygen.
So that it can carry more oxygen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and that's generally true. People who live at high altitudes are generally going to have a higher number of red blood cells than people who live in lower altitudes.
That's amazing.
Because their body's going to make more so it can carry more. The increased production of red blood cells in his blood increased the ability of his blood to carry oxygen. So they weren't as fatiguing and harmful to him. Youngest person to ever climb Mount Everest.
That's crazy.
How old did it say you were?
13.
I would be scared of frostbite, I think.
I would not be going. I can't believe his dad went along with it. Obviously, the mom was not in on that. Or she'd have been like, no.